Hi, I'm Kushruful Yun. This teacher guide is about the Mindset Learn series of lessons on studying poems. These lessons are suitable for learners in the FET band. You may choose to use these lessons with grade 10, 11 or 12 learners depending on the competence of your learners and the purpose for which you are choosing the lessons. In this guide, we tell you what the series of lessons is about and how it links to the curriculum. We also discuss ideas for using the lessons with your learners. You may want to make notes, so have a paper and pencil ready. This series aims to apply some of the terminology and techniques we learnt about in our series of lessons on getting into poetry to studying a range of poems from different genres. There are 8 lessons. 1. Poetry versus prose. 2. Sonnets. 3. Intention, message and comparisons. 4. Protest poetry. 5. Style, tone and atmosphere. 6. Love poetry. 7. Analyzing poems. 8. Communicating through and about poetry. These lessons will help your learners to feel more confident analyzing poetry using poetic terminology and referring to a range of poetic techniques. Most of the lessons in this series address learning outcome 2, reading and viewing. These lessons will assist learners in achieving a range of assessment standards within this outcome, including being able to explore and explain key features of texts and how they contribute to meaning, and in terms of poetry, recognize how word choices, imagery, and sound devices affect mood, meaning, and theme. Recognize that verse and stanza forms, rhyme, rhythm, and punctuation affect meaning. The learning outcome and assessment standards for each lesson are stated at the beginning of each video lesson in the series. In addition, lesson outcomes linked to these are also given in each lesson. Many learners are intimidated by poetry. Our aim in this series is to apply what we've learned about poetic techniques to a range of poems from different genres. In these lessons, we look at a limited number of poems from a wide range of genres. We analyze them in depth and use them to explain, for example, the difference between poetry and prose and how style, tone, and atmosphere are created. These lessons are a good introduction to poetry analysis. However, learners need to be exposed to a range of poems to develop confidence in analyzing poetry. To develop and practice the skills taught in these lessons, you may want to provide your learners with additional examples to analyze, or you may want to encourage them to write poems of their own in the different styles they've learnt about. If possible, you'd find it useful to watch the videos by yourself before you show them to your learners. This will enable you to make notes of the places to stop the video and ask questions or have a discussion. It will also allow you to see when and how you could best incorporate the video lessons into your learning program. You could also think of activities you could do with your learners before or after watching the videos. To get learners interested in these lessons and to keep them involved, you will find it useful to get them to do the tasks and activities presented in the lesson. These tasks are linked to the learning outcomes given in the lessons and to at least one assessment standard in the curriculum policy. Completing the tasks will give both you and your learners evidence of how well they've achieved the lesson outcomes. The tasks can also be used as part of a learner's record of progress towards the assessment standards for each grade. In the case of this series of lessons, you can also apply the techniques for studying poems that are taught in the videos to the poems you are studying in class. Now let's have a more detailed look at the lessons in the series and how you can use them in your classroom. first lesson, we discussed the difference between poetry and prose, as well as some features of poetry such as symbols, rhythm, and figures of speech. Before showing this lesson, you may ask learners to come up with their own definitions of poetry and prose. Then ask them whether they think advertising jingles and lyrics of songs are poetry. After watching this lesson, they'll be able to confirm or modify their definitions. In the second lesson, we take a close look at sonnets, focusing on Shakespeare's sonnet, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" We consider features of sonnets such as their rhythm and rhyme scheme. As we only have time to discuss one sonnet in detail, it would be useful to get learners to analyze another Shakespearean sonnet after viewing this lesson. In the third lesson, we look at how we can determine a poet's intention and message in a poem, and we consider the comparisons that poets use. To extend this lesson, get learners to find other examples of similes and metaphors that are used in poems and get them to explain how these help the poet to communicate a message. This activity would work well in groups. In the fourth lesson, we look at protest poetry. In South Africa's history, poets played a major part in bringing about change through making people aware of the circumstances under which different people lived. In this lesson, we examine one example of protest poetry closely. Your learners may enjoy applying the techniques we use to studying other examples of protest poetry. In this lesson, we define style, tone, and atmosphere and discuss how these are conveyed in poetry.
City, Johannesburg. This way I salute you. My hand pulses to my back trousers pocket or into my inner jacket pocket for my class, my life.
Learners are often intimidated by these concepts and battle to identify and discuss them. In these lessons, we examine the style, tone, and atmosphere in a few poems and give suggestions for how learners can look for and comment on these devices in other poems. To reinforce this lesson, it would be useful to get learners to comment on the style, tone, and atmosphere in a range of poems which may form part of the anthology you are studying in class. In this lesson, we look at love poetry and how poets express their emotions in poems. We discuss one poem in depth, but many of the features we refer to can be found in other poems for additional practice. In this lesson, we put the various poetic techniques that we have learned about into practice as we analyze a South African poem. As you watch this lesson with your learners, encourage them to note how the analysis has been worded and emphasize that this is how they should word their answers in poetry tests and exams. It would also really be worth getting learners to complete the task set for this lesson, as this would enable them to practice analyzing a poem using the same approach as the video lesson. The final lesson in this series is called Communicating Through and About Poetry. In this lesson, we discuss how to answer poetry questions in tests and exams. This is an important skill for learners to master, as it will help to boost their performance in answering any literature questions. At the end of the lesson, we encourage learners to write some poetry of their own. Having a poetry slam, as we described in our series on getting into poetry, might be a fun way to round off the series of lessons. And to check learners have mastered the terminology that was taught in this series, they can then analyze the intention, style, tone, and purpose of their own poems. We hope that you will enjoy using these lessons to introduce your learners to studying poems. If you would like more information about using these lessons or lesson notes for each lesson, please refer to our website www.mindset.co.za. From me, Kushu, goodbye.